for some reason the Hangouts doesn't work with the camera on my Mac, and I tried another tablet with a camera, but that's not. That's the Hangouts doesn't crashes on that, so you'll just have a green screen from me. So,
okay, great. Hello, everyone. This is Tim Cook, and today is episode number 25 of Healthcare IT Live. Today, our guest is Dr. Ed Hammond. He's also known as the father of HL7. Dr. Hammond is a director of Applied Informatics Research at Duke University and is professor emeritus at the School of Medicine there. He's a member of the board of HL7, a member of the International Standards Organization, and the American Medical Informatics Association. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from Duke University. And welcome to the show, Dr. Hammond.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. This is my second attempt. This one appears to be working.
Yeah, the first time was the very first show, so we had some rough technical issues on both ends, but we finally got it connected together, though. Thank you very much. Would you tell us a little bit about your background, about where you're from, how you got involved in healthcare informatics, and
Well, I became involved in healthcare informatics before it became healthcare informatics. Sure. My degree is in electrical engineering, but I've always had a side interest in medicine. And when I've got my PhD in electrical engineering at Duke, Duke's a relatively small place. And so I had a number of friends that were in the School of Medicine. And in contrast to my fellow engineers, when I became a faculty member at Duke, I decided to move into the medical community and work rather than stay in engineering and work with the medical community. So I moved to community and family medicine, and my entire career has been spent in that area. When I became a faculty member, there were a few systems available, largely coming out of the aerospace industry. Lockheed, for example, built a hospital information system at El Camino, and I became interested in these and became interested at Duke in developing hospital information systems and what we now call an electronic health record. My first electronic health record was done in 1970 on a PDP-12, actually a Link 8 computer with 4K of main memory. And you learn how to program very efficiently with that level. And so I've really stayed engaged with that community ever since. And what's happened to me during that, the following time, was a consequence of what was going on. So standards, now working in genomics, translational medicine, population health, have all been a consequence of what's happened around me as I've worked in the field of informatics.
Right. Well, you know, you've earned the name as the father of HL7. Can you tell us a little bit about that story, about the genesis of HL7 and maybe some of its EDI roots and stuff?
Well, you know, I certainly am honored by the title of being father of HL7, but the truth is there are lots of fathers of HL7. And Don Simborg, who did Simborg Industry, was one of the main reasons that the standard organization came into being. And Sam Schultz, a university hospital in Pennsylvania, was the other individual. In the first meeting of this group, we had discussed, we knew standards because, you know, my first experience at Duke in developing a hospital information system was two terminals sitting side by side, and someone sitting at my electronic health record system was looking across at the other terminal and copying lab data off to get into the system. Obviously, that was not very efficient, and we knew we needed some way of moving that data from the lab system into the electronic health record. We called it an automated medical record in those days, but that was a start. And so, in March of 1987, the 75 people came together to discuss if we wanted to start an effort to create standards that would support the exchange of data for the creation of a hospital information system. So that was the beginning of HL7 with some pretty important goals. We decided that we would have a timeline of creating a version of the standards in 6 months. And that actually happened. At some of the meetings, there was as few as 13 people, but it was a group of people who had the technology. They knew what we needed to exchange to make a hospital information system. The only thing that we argued about as to whether the data elements would be tagged, or my argument was there needed to be delimiters, and we would define the content of the data elements of the standard, messaging standard, by position. And the reason for that is when I started doing this, we were talking about 110 baud, 10 characters per second, which is pretty slow. And so there was an overhead with every character that you send from one place to the other. So that was the beginning. We met the goal of version 0.5 at 6 months, version 1.0 at 1 year. And the truth is, version 0.5 simply gave us a fill in a form for the standard. It would be a message that consisted of segments that could be reused in different messages. And also the segments then would be a series of data elements, data fields with components. Version 1.0 then showed some idea of the scope and the completeness of the standard. Happened at the end of 1 year. At the end of 2 years, we ended up with version 2.0, which was the first version that really was seriously implemented, and we began to use version 2.0 to move the laboratory data into the the electronic patient record.
Yeah, so were you initially completely focused on this laboratory data, or did you start thinking about pharmacy and other clinical content?
Well, that's a good question, because there were two groups. With Clem McDonald and an organization called AMSI, which is one of those acronyms that I can never remember what it stands for, were pushing for standards as early as 1983. And so we couldn't get ANSI, the predecessor of AMIA, interested in this. And so as a result, we moved to ASTM and created the first standard purely dealing with laboratory data. And that was, the idea was moving laboratory data from the commercial labs back into the institutions. But Don Simberg was interested in a broader set of standards, including ADT data, lab data, pharmacy data. And so the versions began to deal with the different types of the domains of data elements that we were exchanging. But largely, it focused on ADT and laboratory system, with pharmacy coming in a little bit later, diagnosis coming in a little bit later, billing coming in fairly early. So the number of working groups that we had at the beginning was very, very limited, and it was what we felt we needed to create some form of a hospital information system.
Yeah. Okay. I mentioned before that HL7 has some roots in EDI, and you addressed that by, that you needed to be very efficient during that time. Do you think the continuation of the EDI leaning format has hurt HL7 or made it less flexible in any way?
Well, early on, this was important. And again, the same time we were creating HL7, IEEE was creating, had a group called Medics that was creating a standard as well, but it was model-based. And the truth is that most of the people that were going to the HL7 meeting were going to the IEEE meeting. But that was much more difficult to do. The thing about the HL7 meeting is, once we understood the format that we were going to use, it was pretty easy just to put the data elements that we needed to exchange within that. The thing about version 2 is that it's easy to explain and understand. You can create a spreadsheet with the data elements that you need, map that into your own database, and it's easy to implement the standard. As we moved to a model, it became a little more complex and a little more challenging to understand all the steps necessary to create the messages, and so the complexity. So in the U.S., version 2 standards, 1 is the most widely used, And two is it does the job that we need to do. There's an implementation guide that exists between groups that are communicating that defines what data elements you're going to use and how you're going to use them. Version 2 includes a triplet, a name value pair that can be used to send anything. And in the mid 1980, 81, we were moving entire electronic health records using today's vocabulary, but we had the system that we developed at Duke was used in both obstetrics and in family practice. And the delivery was always in obstetrics, but we tied those two records together, although they were different. So when the patient came into family medicine, we updated the record in OB. When the patient came into obstetrics, we updated the record in family practice. So using HL7, we were able to move all kinds of data, including subjective and physical findings, problems, lab data, medications data, encounter data, and everything. So by defining what was contained within the message using an OBX segment, we could do everything. Now that, from an academic perspective, isn't very satisfying. I know that we now are into models and everything else, but I still much rather explain to an audience about version 2 than version 3.
Right, and of course that's my next question, because now with HL7 v3, we've gone to a model-based set of specifications, but there's a real lack of uptake in version 3. I guess the messaging is fairly robust, but certainly the attempt to build clinical models around the V3 RIM doesn't seem to be attracting very much attention. And I'd like for you to address that. Then I want to come back to the name value pair.
Okay. It depends on the version. The truth is, version 3 messaging is probably used less in the U.S. than many other countries, because V2 is what people are doing. It works for what they need, and there's not the motivation to go back and change. But V3 is the basis for a number of other standards, including the CDA. And V3 is, CDA is model-based. Much of the clinical decision support messages are model-based. Much of the genomic messages are model-based. So it was important to create the RIM and the model. Now, one of the things that I wished were different is the fact that very few models are perfect. And I would be the first to tell you that RIM isn't perfect. But none of the other models I looked at are perfect as well, because they're done over time, and there are lots of people contributing to them. And most people really don't understand how to start with the model itself and come forth. And most people, including me, when I'm creating a CDA or some other standards, I know what data elements I want. I create my CDA, and then I map them back to RIM to make everybody happy. It's the purpose of a model is very important to understand, and the relationship between using a model and using experts in the domain that you're trying to create a standard for, I think is a challenging situation. And as you probably know, the RIM grew over time, started off with data elements and ultimately became a reference information model, but it was built around data models. And one of the things that we started doing was to build on specific data elements in that model, and it got so large it covered the wall of an office. Yeah. And so we then upped the level. I think it's important that looking at the RIM in terms of, first of all, the highest level of knowing it's an act, an entity, a role, and so forth. And then maybe at the next level it begins to be important. And then below that, it becomes important by association with data elements. But constraints, for example, how do you build structures into this? There are different opinions. Yeah. But we're moving ahead, and clearly, I know the association that you have with OpenEHR, and I think that the OpenEHR work and the archetypes has been extremely important. And my, desire is to really see a merger of the products of these two groups.
Right. Well, I think that some of the concepts from both sides are vastly important.
Yes.
I think that there is a middle ground there someplace, and we're searching for that with the Moline project as well. But we want to talk about HL7, and as I said, I want to come back because you mentioned the name value pair concept that is kind of a foundation of V2. And how do you think that relates now to the world of XML and RDF in the big data schemes? Now we're going back to a name value pair or a triple, which is essentially the tagged name value pair type situation. So I think the over-the-wire transmission and that tight association is, it seems to me that there is a parallel coming back to that original concept in V2.
I think that's an excellent observation. You know, we're going to talk about HL7. I think that's appropriate for me, but my interests are much beyond, as you know, to HL7 itself.
Sure.
I actually, when I implemented HL7, I never did the name value. Rather than, you know, the name itself was a triplet. It was the code, it was the text name, and it was the source of that name. The truth is, I only sent the code. And I sent the minimum that I had to send. And the only thing I included in my version 2 messages was everything that was specific to the patient. And so my payload was something like 95% of the message I took out of the HL7 version 2 message and put directly into the patient record. With XML and with the tags, and effectively what most people are doing with version 3 is sending the entire data structure. So the payoff is somewhere between 1% and 3 or 4%. And you know, you can argue that bandwidths are huge now, and that's not important, but big data says otherwise. And when we start sending genomic information and everything else, we really need to go back. I used to argue that we should only transmit the code, but then somebody says, well, if you have a mistake, you'll never know it. And I said, if you have a mistake, fix it. I mean, I think, and so, you know, you need, the codes ought to be sufficient. And why does it have to be human readable? I mean, I've got programs now that can take the code and present it to me in human understandable terms. Why do I have to send that with everything? So again, I think payload is important. I think transmission time, number of characters is extremely important as we really do begin to address big data. But there are a lot of other issues, I think, that relate to big data. And some of the things that are happening now that either HL7 or somebody else really needs to deal with.
That's very interesting. And certainly I don't want to, hold the conversation to HL7, but I didn't want to get too broad a field either. Your work with big data and genomic data management and stuff, I'd love for you to talk about that some, if you would.
Okay, it's a great topic for me. Having been in this field as long as I am, it's exciting to see new things coming in, and I think it's one of the most exciting times ever to be within the field of informatics. I think informatics covers almost everything there is. It's not only healthcare, but almost every topic you want to talk about. And so now we are working with translational medicine. And my appointment here at Duke now is in the Translational Medical Institute, the Duke Translational Medical Institute. And we're working with the genomic community, we're working with clinical trial community, working with patient care, public health, clinical care, public health, and population health. So we're working with the environment, what data do we collect from the environment itself. We're working with GIS. All the patients in our databases, currently we have a GIS code for them. We've pre-calculated distances from patients, residents, to pharmacies, to grocery stores, to restaurant, fast food, anything we can think of that might be interested, including an interstate or including power lines and things of that nature that potentially may have some impact on their health. We're looking at biobanking data, biomarkers. As part of the record, we're looking at how do we capture genetic information, how do we transmit it, and particularly we're looking hard at presentation of that data. We now reach the point of where I think the human cannot comprehend the data that's available. And the compromise is the computer scans the data and shows what's important, and the doctor acts on that. But I think that the more important step, and I'm believer in this is the computer really becomes the decision maker. I mean, this is controversial to the humans involved in patient care, but there's just too much data to make those decisions, and we certainly can't teach every doctor how to become a geneticist. And so all of that data comes into play and makes the decision of these are the tests that need to be done, these are the things that needs to be done, this is the medication that needs to be given based on a widespread set of data, and the physician carries it out. But to me, that's the future, and I think the future really is now, and certainly over the next 5 years, we'll begin to see those changes being made.
Well, I certainly agree, and I think that that's a great vision that you have of the future. I agree with most of it. I will say, though, that the term decision maker for the computer does kind of rub me a little bit. I think decision support is a good thing. Actually, decision making, I don't know, maybe there's a fine line in those definitions.
Yeah, no question about it. I mean, decision support, clinical decision support too. What I really think the computer is capable of doing, first of all, one of the things that the real value of big data is the fact that we now can extract knowledge at a level that we never could before. We're looking at a lot more patients in the studies now, and we're understanding the relationship between many variables and outcomes based on intervention. So that knowledge base, I think, is what I'm really talking about, and access to that knowledge base. For example, if you've got an electronic health record and you put some new data into that electronic health record, my vision is the fact that there are a number of algorithms that get triggered that reevaluates the status of that patient. And there may be 2,000 of these algorithms that are triggered by a set of data that comes in new. So whatever words you want to use, and words are extremely important, particularly when you're dealing with people that this is going to change their behavior significantly, that's very important.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's a little earlier than the half-hour mark, but this is all very interesting, and I know that the panel that we have here, especially Luciana being in public health and stuff, I know she's probably got some questions about this and the potentialities for these multiple algorithms being triggered for public health and the GIS tracking information you were talking about and stuff. So I want to go ahead and open up to the panel for some questions. Mark, Luciana, Jean, anyone? Luciana? Okay.
Well, I'll talk if I'm always happy to talk here if nobody else wants to right now. I think it's really interesting on the genomics, but of course that's the nature half of the argument. There's the nurture is the other half of life, which is capturing all of the stuff that goes on in the environment that influences health and disease. So I did notice that you are doing some interesting things like mapping available grocery stores and things like that. What about other things like sensors of blood sugar, blood pressure, heart rate, activity levels? There's a whole bunch of different inexpensive sensors coming on board which have the ability to produce a lot of data that could potentially be useful when it's put into this mix here.
Yeah, I agree with that statement totally. And one of the research projects that we're conducting here at Duke is what I call healthy independent living for the aging. And I'm making my contribution by aging. And so it's the kind of thing that has happened to me that I'm interested in. And again, I think we need to do a couple of things. We need to understand what sensors, how frequently we sample, and what we do with that result. And so my model has this being done within the household itself. You're doing a personal health network, and we're capturing the data. We're screening that data at that particular level, and our model includes coupling to a medical home. So either I analyze the data, feed back to the individual, or if it's important, I feed it to the medical home and get professional. I call it self-care with somebody looking over your shoulder. And, you know, I think it's important for us to understand. I measure my blood pressure frequently, and it's all over the map. And so I need some way of understanding if it's 147 at a certain time and it drops to 120, do I worry about the 147? If you told me that, I'd panic almost. So I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and I think it's important to couple the research community, the clinical community, into understanding how to interpret the data. But I think there are other kinds of data that we need to capture. Activity is certainly extremely important. I think pain and measurement of pain is important. I think, you know, taking medications. Everybody talks about taking medications, but it's been really interesting in our research in this, the techniques that people do. For me, I'm taking medicines now, and sometimes, you know, I've got a box that has a date on it, you know, a day of the week on it, and a way I can remember whether I've taken it or not is go look and see what days are left, and that works not 100% of the time, but 90% of the time. But we've played with robots telling you, we've played with cell phones telling you, but we're finding people have excellent manual solutions. I have a friend who always has a snack before they go to bed. A big sign on their refrigerator says, "Take your meds," and that person does. So there are all sorts of ways of dealing with that problem, and I don't want to over-instrument it, but I do think that's an important component of what we're talking about, as well as other kinds of things. Activity is important. So thanks, Mark. A good question.
You want to follow up on that, Mark?
No, that's great. I'm glad that you're looking to at all of these other sources. You know, I guess the question is, when is it too much information, or when are things over-instrumented? I guess I personally would lean towards collect as much data as you can, and then, you know, have different algorithms or so on to sort through the cruft and sort out what's not useful. Of course, like you say, your blood pressure occasionally spikes to 147. Now, is that important? Is that not important? If it's most of the time, it's 120. You know, it's how do you decide on those things?
Yeah, I agree with you totally. And again, you know, someone said, well, you should only collect the data that's important. And my answer to that is I don't know what data is important until I collect it. So, but you've got the right attitude. I'm totally on board. Yeah.
Now, the big thing now is big data and data analytics. I think the convergence of basic computer science and translating into clinical necessities, in my experience as a founder of a health information exchange, there's some bit of market economics that drives the demand for these things. And as the market develops, the need and the economic structures and the demand for it will ensure that it gets in place and persists. Because a lot of things gets invented and it's thrown away. But I must say, Dr. Hammond, I'm really glad to have met you with this HL7 thing now, because I'm talking to a man that really knows what's going on. And our HIE is actually based on HL7.
So thank you very much. Yeah, keep going.
Well, I started off like you, had parallel careers. I started off in electrical engineering and I switched to clinical medicine. I've been a clinician all my career, and I retired about 5 years ago, and I'm really focusing on HIT. Learning as I go along.
Well, you know, whatever I've accomplished, it's the fact that I've had a clinician with me. Everything that I've done, and I've implemented my medical record in almost every specialty, but the experts have always come from that clinical community, and I think that's important, because I think even HL7 has characteristics of where it's a technical person watching a doctor behave and trying to figure out what they're doing and duplicating that without recognizing they do what they do because they don't have any other tools or any other choices. it's important to really understand the fundamental problems that you're trying to solve. And I think that's where a lot of my current work is really trying to understand what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And the engineers see some gadget that they think is really great, and they look for a solution instead of going about it the other way. So, I think people like you who really have a solid clinical base now, and again, I would advise you to be very careful and not try to guess what the technical community is capable of doing. But if you can define for me what you want to do, then I would consider that to be the most valuable contribution to my research and trying to figure out how to do it.
Oh, we lost your audio, Gary. Oh, there you go.
Oh, what happened? You got me now?
Yeah. Yep.
I noticed you were talking about Duke University and patient-centered medicine and remote monitoring. Does Duke have any of these functionalities that they've enabled that they're using clinically?
Yeah, in fact, Duke is typical with what's happening in much of the United States now. As part of meaningful use in getting our incentive payments, we now are creating a single system across the enterprise. It's a transition from what we had before, which was much of our own developed stuff. And now we're implementing the EPIC system across 3 hospitals and like 135 clinics, and so it's about a 3-county area that plus some extra that we're responsible for. But a lot of the research that's going on here really is in translational medicine, and it's combining some of the new ideas with clinical research. Duke's probably got one of the best clinical research databases, one of the most famous certainly in the world, with the the Duke Clinical Research Institute, and we're working closely with that group, as well as the clinical group. Duke has activities in population health. We're working with that group. Duke has a lot of work in personalized medicine. And the thing that I've learned is that none of these are adequate by themselves. I mean, genomics, a gene mutation can't predict who will have the disease, so it's got to be other factors that relate to that. So epigenetics is one of the words now that I like and I'm using in trying to define what I'm really talking about. But Duke has a great deal of research going on and certainly an open mind, and we really are understanding now at a different level the fact that it is a continuum from basic science all the way through population health.
Dr. Hammond, just as a point here, would you please give us a definition of translational medicine?
Yes, sorry I'm using, that's become a big word for us because there is the huge grants, the CTSA grant, which is Clinical Translational Science Award. Translational medicine largely is around the coupling of that community from genomics through patient care. And it's T1 through T4 is the branches, 4 divisions of it. It really starts at basic science and leads to population health. So what it really means is eliminating the silos that existed for many, many years, up until just recently, between each of these different groups of patient research and patient care. And so it is moving, reusing the data. It's got to be bi-directional. And so, if we're moving from basic science and genomics into the clinical data, we're using that to make decisions, but we're also feeding clinical data back to the basic scientist to really understand what clinical data and what environmental data is important that will influence the particular expression of a gene in terms of an individual's health. So it's crossing that full field.
Yeah, that's a huge bridge that's needed to be crossed for a long, long time between basic sciences and clinical medicine, I feel like. Luciana, you had some questions.
Yes, I do. Number one, I would like to thank you, Professor Hammond, to be here with us in this afternoon. I'm honored to be here in this panel and listening to you and all your wisdom. It's really motivating for young researchers like me, and I'm very happy to see my students here attending. Isa and André. André is underage, so I have to be together with Isa. And João is a PhD student that we have a lot of connections here in Brazil as well. And so it's good to see friends and colleagues listening to you and new people as well, Mark and Gary. And I would like to talk a little bit about translational medicine and some the ideas that the way that we see here in Brazil, in Latin America, actually, what translational medicine is, because here in Latin America, social epidemiology is a strong field, and so we include in translational medicine this combination of basic research, molecular epidemiology, clinical epidemiology, social epidemiology, and health economics. This is the way that we look at translational medicine, as the combination and the conjunction of all those fields, and they need to work together to make the four phases of translational medicine to happen. And then it's interesting because in 1998 the word was not that fashion, but the Hook in the American Journal of Epidemiology wrote a seminal paper that was called Bringing Context Back into Epidemiology. That's exactly what she's talking about bringing social context back into clinical and molecular epidemiology. That was it was a emerging field at that time. And being a physician and an epidemiologist, because this is my background, I can tell that most of the patients that I've been seeing in primary care and in hospitals, when I work in emergencies as a public health physician, because we have public health physicians in emergencies here in Brazil, what I've seen is that it's very difficult just for you to have a biomedical problem that needs to be addressed with the type of 20th century medicine that we learned, that is only focused on the biological aspects of the health and disease. The psychosocial problems are always together for each case for each patient, for each citizen when they reach the healthcare setting. And then I look at HO7, and I can see now from April the 1st, now I can see a little bit better the specifications because they were made open, but before it was difficult because Brazil is not a member and my university is not a member. But what I understand from the standard is that HO7 is mostly focused on clinical models. And so I would like to hear your opinions on how to expand HO7 to cover the scope of translational medicine.
That's a good question, and thank you very much for the compliments. I will say we learned from you, and I learn constantly from my students, as you probably recognize too. The questions they ask and what they discover are very, very important. I must confess that I was one of the proponents that HL7 standard should be made available at no charge from the very, very beginning. But the economic model that we were using, depending on the membership, and it's only now that we are willing to risk, and it is a risk, for HL7 to make the standards available. But if you're trying to provide a product for everybody to use, then it needs to be easily available, and that's what we're trying to do now. I created within HL7 a group called the Clinical Interoperability Council. And the purpose of the Clinical Interoperability Council was to bring the clinical world into the world of standards, but not bore it to death with how people that are technical experts talk. And so I have a picture that has a big fence between the technical people in HL7 and the clinical people from HL7. So we begin to move in that direction. And my own activities as it gets more involved in epidemiology the kind of things that you were talking about, because I think they're extremely important, including the social aspects. And as you well know, the people that have the most disease are the lowest social, economic, educated class of people, and how we deal with that, I think, is an important challenge to society. And I think that some of the standards that we're using are very important. You know, this whole concept of privacy versus really knowing and understanding the issues, even the vocabulary, the process of going to the emergency room instead of a doctor, are behavior changes that are extremely important. And so what we're trying to do, among other things, is HL7 now has created a new category of membership that would do more than expose you to just getting access to the standards. It would help educate you, but to give you a forum of understanding how to use the standards appropriately and what other standards that we really need to begin to address within HL7. And part of that, really, I mean, increasingly now, we need vocabulary, terminology to capture terms that aren't data elements in the classical sense of lab data and medication data, and really a physical exam parameter. It really has to do with feeling, and certainly the concept of patient-reported outcomes really does need standardization and a vocabulary set. And so I'm now trying to get HL7 to move in that direction, but we've created a new category of membership that I don't know what the price tag is, but like $100 a year for membership that would give you exposure to some discussions, teaching, and things of that nature. We are discussing now increasing opportunities of having the clinical community come together. And the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association, has just created a set of its own standards that will ultimately be balloted through HL7, but really are totally generated by that clinical community. That includes, among other things, creating a catheterization report based on the technology of the CDA, but really it's a group of cardiologists agreeing on what that content would be. This is going to be extremely important in terms of structure, completeness, consistency, being able to find the data. So we are beginning to move in that direction, and I think there are going to continue to be other clinical groups that will come that will create the standards and use the HL7 process to provide the authority and following a set of rules that create those standards. But there's no question about it, and I would say to you that Duke itself, unrelated to HL7, has a close working relationship with Brazil. In the northern part of Brazil, a group of people that really didn't know the clinical informatics folks around Rio and Sao Paulo, but are coming from the engineering background that I had the opportunity of working with last year. And this group is going to be very, very productive. So lots of fun. I liked your comments. I agree with you totally.
Would you like to follow up on that?
Well, I think that Ludwig wants to ask a question.
He says he has a sound problem, but his question is, is HL7 used in occupational medicine?
It's used in occupational medicine, and there are some specific standards related to occupational medicine. I mean, part of that is really capturing, for example, the exposure data as part of an occupation, and that could be sound, it could be chemicals, and other things. So there are activities in that area. Whether there are other standards that we really need in occupational medicine, I think it's a good question. I'm to the unhappiness of a number of people trying to move HL7 more and more. For example, I think there should be a standard that would define a hospital-acquired infection so that we can effectively compare the rate of hospital-acquired infection. It's a huge leading cause of death, and we compare hospitals, but we have no standard for the comparison. I mean, that's a kind of standard. So I see HL7 moving more and more into clinical IT standards, and I'm sticking the word IT in rather than clinical standards. Clinical IT standards. These are standards that relate to clinical areas, but have the communications, the data component as part of that.
Okay, thank you. And he would like to know where he could find some data on that on the internet. Do you have a source to Google or a link?
I don't have it specifically. I mean, I would go to the HL7 webpage, I'm not sure that's the clearest place in the world to find what you're looking for. And so I don't know a link right now to that, but I'll look. And if he would send me an email with that question, I'll try to track down something specific for him. But I do know that there's a working group. I don't know whether it's environmental health group. I would have to look to see what group is dealing with this. It may be patient care, but if you'll send me an email, I'll try to track it for him.
Okay, he could do that, or he could post his email in the chat box there, and you could pick it up.
All right, that would work. Yeah.
I also have a question from one of the online viewers, is from Shinji Kobayashi. He was curious as to why HL7 adopted the pipe symbol as a token separator.
Well, I'm responsible for that. And the reason is because if you look at the electronic health record that I created a long time ago, the database, I created my own language, by the way, in 1970 because there was no language. And so I was trying to create a database in which the delimiters were easy to recognize. And so the pipe had a vertical bar. It's not likely to be included in anybody's text. For example, a semicolon or a comma is a terrible delimiter because it's apt to be included in the text. So I try to get things that wouldn't normally be in the text. And so I'm using, the pipe is the best, and it really looks like filter bars for separating out the data fields. And then using, the explanation point, although I got into trouble with that every once in a while. The squiggly bar, the caret, there's another one that isn't apt to be in text. So I try to find things that give me good visible separation, but aren't apt to use in text components.
I think it was probably a good choice for those reasons, and it's been well proven in EDI and in other places as a very valuable delimiter as well. As long as you don't try to use it on a Unix command line, maybe.
Well, I get into trouble somewhere with everything.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does anyone else have any questions?
Well, I would like to just to add to something that was very quickly covered at a certain moment, because Dr. Hammond associated you with the OpenEHR Foundation, and I felt a little bit jealous because now you are an international collaborator of our research laboratory, Tim. And we're developing the multi-level healthcare specifications together, actually. Tim is transferring this technology to us, and we are giving the clinical feedback. And I think that we know that some conversations to reach to an agreement between HL7v3 and multi-level modeling, the OpenEHR version of the multi-level modeling have been trying over the years. And we know that the consensus in medicine is difficult, and so that is something that is transferred to medical informatics, and so consensus in medical informatics is difficult as well. And so sometimes it's good for you to be like Copernicus that was in Poland, building the heliocentric system, because we are here in Brazil, and so nobody's looking at us, and so we could try some new ideas. And I think that what we have now as a solution in our research lab is quite interesting, because the basis is the HL7 data types as they were defined in the ISO 21090 standards. And I would like to say something. And I was morally exposed from the ISO mirror here in Brazil because I wanted the ISO 21090 to be translated and adopted as a standard here in Brazil, and that was not very well accepted because there are some people with economic interests that don't want interoperability to happen, because we know that not having interoperability is more easily and more quickly profitable. And so I would like to make this statement that I think that it was very good that HL7 went to the ISO and pushed the approval of the ISO 21090 data types standard, because for me this is the granularity where you will start to define semantic interoperability, and I think that that was a great accomplishment of the HL7 community.
So again, that was an activity that I agreed with you, and I was the person who had to convince people in HL7 that was a good move, and I still have to convince them at times that that's a good move too. But Graham Grieve, who's been on this program, is a fantastic diplomat. What Graham is probably accepted by much of the world as being as unbiased as you can be by an organization, biased only by the quality of the work that he's doing. And Graham accepted the responsibility of bringing efforts together, which was ISO data types, SIN data types, HL7 data types, and trying to mold those into a single group. And I think he's done a good job. It's like everything else that we technical people tend to do. We never know when to quit. And so, how far do you take data types? You can take data types to the entire world as a data type. And so we need to understand those boundaries. And we talk about simple and primitive data types, which is probably covers 90% of what all of us ever need. And then you begin to get into the specialized data types that are important at times, but you can take it too far. And ultimately, when I'm really making decisions, I need to access the level of granularity at the lowest level, because those are the inputs that I need to take from my sensors and put into my algorithms. And so whatever that structure is, it needs to let that happen. But humans are humans. We want to keep going. I always say a modeler never stops modeling forever and ever.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can see that with the clinical models. There's never 100% consensus anywhere. Everybody has their own little ideas. And that's one of the problems with clinical models. You brought up Graham Grieve's name, and yes, he was a great guest. In fact, he attended this hangout on vacation on a camping trip in the middle of the woods. I thought it was awesome.
That's great.
But in relation to that, Chad Johnson is an online viewer, and he's asking, what do you think of HL7 Fire?
Well, I like it. I was there when Graham really thought of that idea. Was trying to work in V2, V3. I set up a task force when I was chair of HL7, looking at V2 and V3, and Graham was part of that, and he really came to this new concept. And as part of that's addressing this idea of modelers never quit modeling, and dealing with the concept of resources. It reminds me of the early days in HL7 when we were creating the version 2 standard. It really has an openness about it that deals with the resources, and it's the 80-20 process. If we can get 80% of what we need is part of the round of that. So I think FIRE is probably going to become extremely important to HL7. It'll probably blend into a lot of things that are actually happening with HL7. So I'm a FIRE fan, and I think it's extremely important for HL7.
Well, let me ask if I can get some inside information out of you. How much weight did Graham's insistence that he was going to give FIRE to HL7, but insisted that it be open? How much weight did that carry in the meetings to open up some of the other specifications?
I thought it was significant. It's something I've been pushing forever.
Yeah.
And the timing of this was perfect because we had begun to talk, and the board voted unanimous at a retreat this past year to open up the standard itself. And the truth is that it was being used by a number of countries. It was being used by the U.S. government. It was being used by hospitals who didn't even know they were using it. And so trying to do anything other than making that standard available was unrealistic. And again, HL7 is spending some nervous periods of time of worrying about our survival. But again, I think that the value of HL7 to the world is such that we will continue to have a financial base to continue to create the standards. You know, again, I get branded with HL7. I get the label, which I'm proud of being the father of HL7. But to me, HL7's major contribution is the openness of the environment. It's always really been that anybody could come in with an idea and push on it and create the standards. Is it perfect? No. Do the standards perfect? No. But if something doesn't work, then my belief is come back and fix it. And I hope we can continue to move in that direction with all of the world, because there's so much to do now and so few of us to do it. We really do need to not become redundant and competitive.
Absolutely. I've never thought that the economics of joining HL7 was a problem. My issue was about the fact that I was constrained. If I built something that used HL7, I couldn't give that away. And to me, that was a big constraint. Now, I know that there are projects out there that are open source and they use HL7, and I'm sure that's a legal quagmire for everybody. But hopefully this openness will solve some of those issues, because HL7 is out there. It's available. Without ever joining, I can get all of the specifications.
And Tim, I know you've been a little bit critical about our re-examining IP. We're continuing to look at that. And you got to recognize the fact that some people thought this is the worst thing that could ever happen to HL7. So you've got to work through that.
Absolutely.
The people set to get there. And again, you know, I think what we're trying to do is to find something that will preserve the financial integrity of HL7 and yet meet the needs of the broader community. And it's just taking us a little time to get there.
Oh, absolutely. And I realize that there are serious economic concerns here, and I don't know what the solution of the economic model is. I don't see that as my problem. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm trying to get them to take $1 billion insurance policy on me. They won't have to wait that long, so we need to solve it. Yeah,
that's true. That's true, and it's great to see these steps in that direction. I think it's one of the greatest things of this decade. That's for sure. Do we have any other questions? No more questions from the panel?
Well, I thank you. It's a lovely audience, and Tim, I thank you for what you've done. This is, you know, I've come on a few of these, but my time commitments have gotten me into trouble. But I've gone back and looked at some of the recorded sessions, and I haven't ever been able to look at one from start to finish. I get about halfway through and something happens, but it's a great repository of the data, and certainly we assign some students, go look at this. Good.
Oh, well, thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It's, you know, it started out fun. It's still fun. I hope the format is good. I know an hour long is tough to sit down and watch a video for an hour, but if we try to make it any shorter, then I don't know what kind of format we would have.
No, I agree with you. Yeah, I agree.
So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Hammond, for sharing your time with us and being patient and coming back again when we couldn't work out the technical stuff before. And thank the panel again, our faithful panel we have here. I want to say that next week we will have Stan Huff, who's the CMIO at Intermountain Healthcare. It's one of the largest healthcare organizations in the U.S. If you're not familiar with that, and I promise that will be an enlightening and exciting show as well. So we'll see you all back next week. Take care.
Bye.